In this video we will review some facts about Mesopotamia. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for future updates. The wheel was invented and utilized for the first time in Mesopotamia. They invented royalty and law, as well as many other concepts we now associate with civilization. For these and other reasons, historians and archaeologists refer to Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. With these Mesopotamia facts, you may learn more about our common ancestors. The name Mesopotamia has its own history. The name, which means country between rivers, was coined by the ancient Greeks in reference to how the Tigris and Euphrates rivers delimited Mesopotamia. They also used it as a translation for the region's Hebrew name, Naharaim. In the Old Testament, Naharaim has a similar meaning, Aram between the rivers. One of the world's oldest and most sophisticated alphabets was created by the Mesopotamians. We call it cuneiform, but that was not the name given to it by the Mesopotamians. It means wedge-shaped writing, referring to how the letters appear as wedge shapes. The form was inspired by how the Mesopotamians wrote their alphabet with chopped reeds. Meanwhile, in the 3rd millennium BC, the Sumerians invented cuneiform. They also based it on an older pictographic proto-alphabet from the 4th millennium BC. The cuneiform alphabet was used by succeeding civilizations such as the Babylonians and Assyrians. Cuneiform was also used by neighboring cultures such as the ancient Egyptians. They utilized it mostly in diplomacy, letting people from different cultures to interact and exchange common documents and agreements in a single format. Gilgamesh was the greatest hero of the Mesopotamians. The story, on the other hand, arose from King Gilgamesh of Uruk's historical activities in the 2600s BC. During his rule, Uruk dominated the Sumerian city-state's incessant struggles for dominance. He made such an impression on the residents of his city, and even the Sumerians, that after he died, his life became a myth and legend throughout Mesopotamia. The Epic of Gilgamesh, in instance, presented him as a demigod, but unlike other demigods, Gilgamesh wasn't only half god and half human. Instead, he was 3/4 god and 1/4 human. Gilgamesh and his comrade Enkidu's adventures battling monsters, challenging the gods, and finally seeking and even gaining immortality would have an impact on the ancient Greeks. Some experts believe Heracles was the Greeks attempting to show Gilgamesh as a Greek for a Greek audience. Mesopotamian mathematics is still used today all around the world. The Sumerians were the first people to write multiplication tables and study division and geometry. Later, the Babylonians developed the base 60 mathematical system that is still in use today. They calculated that there are 60 seconds in every minute, 60 minutes in every hour, and 360 degrees in a single circle. They also invented the 24-hour day, and while they never fully discovered zero, they understood and applied it contextually in their mathematics. The Babylonians were also aware of pi, which they used to calculate the circumference of a circle. However, the value they used to calculate pi turned out to be 3.13 rather than 3.14. The Mesopotamians also made significant contributions to astronomy. The Sumerians started it, and the Babylonians and Assyrians picked up where the Sumerians left off. Their observations of the sky, along with the profound mathematical understanding, enabled Mesopotamian astronomers to properly forecast eclipses and solstices. It also enabled him to create an accurate 12-month calendar based on moon phases. Long before Copernicus, a Mesopotamian may have devised the heliocentric idea. In the 2nd century BC, Seleucus of Seleucia based his study on Aristarchus of Samos' idea. However, Seleucus demonstrated that the Earth orbited the Sun rather than the other way around. The particular method he used is unknown today, but archaeologists have collected enough evidence to conclude that Seleucus's demonstration required measurements of how the moon's movements influence the tides. The Mesopotamians used an eclectic approach to medicine. On the one hand, they used the scientific method, relying on physical examinations of a patient's health and symptoms to make diagnoses and prognoses. They also kept meticulous notes on their patients and their illnesses. This enabled them to narrow down new cases by cross-referencing them with old ones. Mesopotamian doctors also wrote prescriptions, giving them authority over the medications their patients took. Mesopotamian medicine, on the other hand, had its fair share of superstition. They saw diseases or ailments with unknown causes or cures as the result of a curse in particular. They would then perform exorcisms in an attempt to break the curse. Many technologies were invented by the Mesopotamians. Mesopotamians were pioneers in the production and use of numerous metals. These include, in addition to precious metals such as gold and silver, bronze and iron. The Assyrians are also credited as being the first society to establish an empire based on technological dominance, notably through the employment of iron armor and weapons. This enabled them to dominate their neighbors, who continued to employ weaker and softer bronze for weapons and armor. The Mesopotamians also invented glass-making and cloth-weaving, as well as one of the world's most intricate irrigation systems. The network of canals and aqueducts they built was so sophisticated that it remained in use until it was destroyed millennia later by Mongol invasions. And they were found to be so complicated that no one knew how to reconstruct the devastated old infrastructure once the Mongols were defeated. The Mesopotamians, like many other ancient nations, worshipped a plethora of gods. They had 3 gods competing for the top spot: An, the sky deity, Enlil, the wind god, and Enki, the water god. The Mesopotamians also thought Enki taught humanity how to establish civilization. They also had a god or goddess for each of the 7 most important celestial bodies. Shamash, the sun god, Nana, the moon god, and Ishtar, the goddess of war, love, and the planet Venus are among them. Nergal was in charge of the disease and the planet Mars, whereas Nabu was in charge of scribes, writing, and the planet Mercury. Marduk was the Jupiter deity who assassinated Tiamat, the primordial creation goddess. Meanwhile, Saturn's god was Ninurta. Only the most important Mesopotamian gods and goddesses are represented. Others include Ereshkigal, the goddess of the underworld, and Ninsun, the fabled mother of Uruk's king Gilgamesh. The Bible was influenced by the Mesopotamian creation story Enuma Elish. For begin, the primordial founders, Apsu and Tiamat, exist alone over a dark ocean in the Enuma Elish. They created all that exists from there, similar to how Genesis portrays God's spirit floating over a dark ocean before creating everything out of nothing. Scholars also point out that Enuma Elish descriptions of creation are stretched out over 7 clay tablets, much like Genesis' description of creation over 7 days. As a result, they propose that the biblical creation myth borrowed from the Enuma Elish while simultaneously presenting a contrast. God, in particular, created everything on his own, whereas Apsu and Tiamat had to collaborate to create, thereby contrasting monotheism and polytheism. They also had their own version of the Great Flood myth. It appears in the Gilgamesh epic as well as the Atra-Hasis from the 18th century BC. A god, similar to the biblical narrative, causes the Great Flood to punish humanity. However, in the Mesopotamian account, it was not because humanity had turned evil, but merely because they had become too loud. This irritated Enlil, who threatened them with a flood, but Enki forewarned the human Utnapishtim. Under Enki's direction, Utnapishtim constructed a boat in which he, his family, their household, and pairs of every animal alive might survive the flood. When the Great Flood arrived, the gods instantly regretted Enlil's actions. When it was over, they immortalized Utnapishtim and his wife as a reward for ensuring the survival of life on Earth. This eventually led to Gilgamesh meeting with Utnapishtim in order to discover the key to eternal life. The Mesopotamians were also the first to develop the concept of logic. The Babylonians, in particular, were the first to grasp the concept of logic, which represented their rigid and static social framework. They discovered it axiomatic when they constructed additional logic, in a manner comparable to the logical framework devised by 20th-century economist John Keynes. The Babylonians also recognized the potential of logical system alterations produced by external factors. They also applied logic outside of academia, to astronomy and medicine. They also had an impact on later Greek philosophers. The Mesopotamians, according to modern researchers, set the groundwork for Western philosophy. Their folklore and cultural wisdom, particularly in the shape of literature and oral traditions, supplied them with a foundational understanding of life that gave way to formal ethics. The Babylonians expanded on this, producing schools of thought that were very comparable to those of the Greek sophists, Socrates' Socratic method, and even Platonic philosophy. Every month, the Mesopotamians held a festival. The New Year festival, which always took place on the first full moon after the spring equinox, was one of the fixed ones. Other fixed festivals commemorated historical events such as the founding of their city or a significant triumph in the past. Other holidays, on the other hand, became far more flexible, dependent on elements such as the lunar calendar, the seasons, and, of course, religion. In a Mesopotamian city-state, the king's recent achievement was also cause for joy. The Mesopotamian oud was the forerunner to later musical instruments. It resembles a guitar, with 11 strings divided across 6 courses. Meanwhile, there are versions with 5 courses and 10 strings, as well as 7 courses and 13 strings. Archaeological evidence suggests that the oud existed as long as 5,000 years ago. It is still used in the Middle East today, although in Europe it evolved into the lute, which finally gave way to current keyboard instruments. The Mesopotamians entertained themselves by playing a variety of games. Hunting was especially popular among the nobles, as was a type of polo played on the shoulders of another person rather than on a horse. Boxing and wrestling, on the other hand, had a wider audience than just the nobles, and were popular among commoners as well. The Mesopotamians also had their own form of backgammon, dubbed the royal game of yore by archaeologists. That moniker, however, is merely a placeholder until they can figure out what the Mesopotamians truly called it. Mesopotamian society was patriarchal. With a few exceptions, such as Queen Semiramis of Assyria, monarchs almost always controlled Mesopotamian city-states and nations. Another kind of evidence is how men dominated the priesthood. However, exceptions exist, such as the sacred priestesses of Ishtar. In general, Mesopotamian homes were led by fathers, who then taught their sons their craft or apprenticed them to masters. Daughters stayed at home to learn household management from their mothers. Women, however, had their own rights even in a patriarchal culture. They could inherit and own personal property, and they could even divorce their husbands if they had a legitimate reason. They also had a sophisticated economy. The Mesopotamians possessed the world's oldest banks, with temples providing systematic loaning and credit systems. They even had their own properties, accounting for up to a third of all accessible land at one point in Sumerian history. However, later on, royal and other private landowners competed with and diminished the priesthood's properties. Overall, archaeologists have discovered parallels between Mesopotamian economics and modern post-Keynesian economics. The Mesopotamians loved to construct massive structures. Their pyramids, in particular, demonstrated this, despite the fact that, unlike the ancient Egyptians, the Mesopotamians never built any smooth-sided pyramids. Instead, they constructed ziggurats, which are typically square platforms of decreasing size stacked on top of one another. They then erected alternating stairways up the walls of the ziggurats, eventually reaching a temple at the top. A ziggurat resembled a mountain in this fashion, with the gods residing at the highest top in the skies. Climbing a ziggurat also represented ascending to the skies. In fact, current academics agree that the biblical Tower of Babel was inspired by Mesopotamia. The Atemenanki of Babylon, in particular, was between 50 and 90 meters tall, making it one of the world's highest structures at the period. The Mesopotamians also created the first legal codes in history. We've all heard of the Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, but that's only the most well-known. Even so, it is best known for establishing the notion of eye for an eye, which archaeologists interpret as an indication of rising harshness in Mesopotamian legal systems. Older rules, such as those compiled by Sumerian monarchs such as Urukagina and Lipit Ishtar, are more forgiving than Hammurabi's. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel, since we will be covering a lot of similar content in the future. Till next time, stay curious.